Good evening. Welcome all to our studio recording session tonight on Korea and banking in the 1970s. This corporate session will illuminate contributions of Americans working in Korea in the 1970s and how American banks played a key role to Korea's economic success and eventual takeoff. My name is Nikita Desai. I'm the Director for Policy and Corporate Programs, and I'm pleased to welcome our three panelists tonight, John Day, Phil Sherman, and Jim Whiteley. John Day opened the Seoul office for the First National Bank of Chicago in 1974 and helped convert it to a branch in 1976. John's banking career spanned 17 years with First Chicago in international and project finance, branch management, and key corporate relationship positions in Chicago, New York, Tokyo, Seoul, and San Francisco. He also spent 13 years with Salomon Smith Barney and Citigroup. Phil Sherman in the center. He's our dedicated corporate member. This was really his idea, and we're really pleased to have him here in the role of panelist and moderator. Phil was the country corporate officer for Citibank in Korea from 1974 to 1978 and served as chairman of the Foreign Bankers Association and as VP for the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea. He received Korea's Order of Diplomatic Merit, Seunggi, in 1978 for his contributions to Korean finance and economic development during his tenure in Korea. Mr. Sherman was also the head of Citibank in Italy and Germany. After Citibank, Mr. Sherman was the founding CEO of Asian Securitization and Infrastructure Assurance Private Limited Singapore, Asia's first financial guarantee insurance business led by the Asian Development Bank, the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation, and Capital Markets Assurance Corporation. James Whitley, who goes by Jim, opened the representative office for Marine Midland Bank in Seoul in 1972 and served as the representative there in Korea for 4 years. Prior to his banking career, he spent 2 years in Korea, Seoul, and Busan, working for CARE, which is an American relief organization many of you must know. He retired from JP Morgan Chase after a 37-year career in banking, including assignments in Southeast Asia and Canada, and currently serves on several nonprofit boards. Would you please join me in welcoming our three panelists tonight? Thank you.
Thank you. The underlying premise, as Nikki has mentioned, of our panel is that the 1970s were a real takeoff for the Korean economy, and it really, while it had some ups and downs in the interim, has really continued to rise until Korea's current very strong economic, political, and social position. The economic policies that we three operated under when we were American bankers in Korea, I think could be characterized as East Asian economic policy, by which I would mean a strong concentration on agriculture, using the surplus wealth created by improvements in agriculture to build a strong export industry, which has, of course, in the case of Korea, continued until today. To make this work required, on the one hand, strong financial controls, and on the other hand, a very great push and impetus and participation by all of the Korean people. A combination of good leadership at the technical and political levels, and then real determination, which I think all of us saw when we were there, on the part of virtually everybody in the country, that Korea would be successful. At the same time, this was not a policy without risks. It required borrowing a lot of money, and in particular, the putting money into the heavy and chemical industries, which were the success of which were by no means assured at the time. That's the general background against which our activities went on. Jim Whiteley was, of the three of us, the one who lived in Korea first, 1972, and he'll come here with a brief word on what things were like as the decade began.
Well, I'll go back even farther to the earlier decade, which is when I left Korea. the conditions, believe me, were entirely different when I came back in 1971. Originally, I was in Tokyo, and I was covering um, Korea from Tokyo. The At that time when I arrived, the economy was still focused on footwear, on textiles, and you know but still having chosen an export-oriented strategy for development. Um, and I, having had that background, the change of coming into a Korea which was just taking off was really exciting, because I had seen when I left Korea originally a country which was still trying to decide where it was going. Park Chung-hee had just come into power. But I saw, when I came back in 1971, a country that had expanded in those 10 years an average growth rate of 10%. Things were still tough, and we'll get into that later. But for the most part, it was thrilling for me to see what the Koreans had done in that interim period. So,
Picking up from what Jim was saying in 1970, at the end of 1973, I think, as we're all aware, that the Saudis raised the price of oil by 4 times, basically from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel, which precipitated the so-called first oil shock. And of course, that hit Korea very hard, because Korea relied on petroleum for virtually all of its energy. The swing in the balance of payments over a period of time was about $1.5 billion, which in those days, certainly $1 billion was actually quite a lot of money. It may not be considered quite that now, but it was a lot. And this started to work through the market. And whereas, as Jim was mentioning, the things had been moving along pretty well in the early 70s, they stopped moving too well. And I had mentioned before that there was a heavy dependence on foreign financing. That became very difficult to obtain. As a result of that, the government got together with worked on their plan and so on, and with the help of the IMF, they came up with a rather comprehensive plan to deal with the situation. One of the characteristics of Korea is that they have never really looked to other people to do the work that they could do themselves, and this was certainly the case then. So they devalued the currency, they tightened money, they lowered the temperature of buildings so that heating could not be higher than 68 degrees in the wintertime, which of course landlords were quite happy to cooperate with. The other part of the strategy was to do a large loan, mainly, well, not mainly, partially for the purpose of raising money, but also partially for the purpose of just gaining support from the international banking community. I personally had been involved in cross-border lending to Korea in the early 70s, and I had moved as the manager in Seoul in September of 1974. The really kind of came home to us on Chuseok, which was a holiday in Korea, of course. We had the foreign bank softball tournament, and I, like a good manager of the bank, played in the foreign bank softball tournament, and basically could hardly walk when I got home. And I had a call from a man called Mr. Hong at the Ministry of Finance, and this was probably 5:30 in the afternoon. Would I please come to see the Minister of Finance? And of course, in Korea, if the Minister of Finance asks you to come and see him, you come. So I put on my dark blue suit and white shirt and so on and so forth, and asked the Mr. Hong at the ministry if he could send his car up to pick me up to take me there, because as a newcomer, I wasn't actually quite sure of how to get there from my house to the ministry. At that point, the minister had said that he had had consultations with various banks in the United States and other countries at the IMF meeting, and they had decided that they did want to move ahead with a large loan, and would Citigroup, or Citibank as we were then, please be the manager of this loan, lead the group, that it couldn't be done just as a club, but it needed some organization. So I wasn't 100% sure what we could do, because this came as a little bit of a surprise to people in New York, unlike today when you just call on the phone in three seconds. They hadn't really communicated too much to us about the meeting. So I, of course, in a good banker way, said, well, sure, of course, we'll work on this and get going, and so on and so forth. And we started to do that. A lot of details of the loan, I think, are probably not of such great interest to the folks here, or maybe on the video, but they're in the handout that we gave out. But this was a loan that was meant to show that the international banking community was strongly behind Korea, and that support by itself would give a kind of moral basis for others to come in and be positive and helpful to Korea. Both First of Chicago and Marine Midland were major participants, managers of the loan, and I'd like to pass the torch first to John and then to Jim to talk about their decision-making process. My view of the loan at the time, I think, and it hasn't really changed subsequently, and it's also in the other handout we gave you, which is a Far Eastern Economic Review article. This was a very difficult decision to make, and I think it's worth thinking about a little bit. How did the banks get into this? What were their considerations? And it all worked out very nicely in the end, as we know, but wasn't quite so clear at the time.
Well, to step back a bit, I first visited Korea in 1969 when I was working in the Tokyo representative office of First National Bank of Chicago. First Chicago was among the 10 largest money center banks in the country, and one of 2 that were headquartered in Chicago. And rather late in the game, we were expanding our international presence. There was Tokyo converted to a branch. We long had a branch in London. And we'd been doing business in Korea from offshore for quite a while, working with trade finance customers, Cargill, a huge grain exporter, through the Commodity Credit Corporation, Sears Roebuck, which in those days was one of the largest importers in the country, so we had large facilities with the Korean banks on a correspondent basis. I actually moved to Seoul in '74 from Chicago after completing a feasibility study and receiving an invitation from the then Deputy Prime Minister Chung Ki-young, who was a former head of the Bank of Korea, to open an office. We intended to do that and to work toward converting it to a branch. It coincided with the balance of payments squeeze, and we're back to your story on that.
Well, no, but you guys put in $25 million, which is a good deal of money in those days. What was the discussion?
Well, the discussion basically, when we opened the representative office, we'd increased the country limit, and we had always been pretty careful about country exposures. Through trade finance, and particularly working with the U.S. Export-Import Bank, we'd been able to leverage the exposure we had in Korea. For example, we'd worked on financing the first 747 and first 2 DC-10s for Korean Airlines. Export-Import Bank had been guaranteed by Korea Exchange Bank, but they guaranteed 85–90% of those loans. So it had a huge impact in Korea, but frankly, it didn't eat up that much of our country limit. We were approached by you, of course, as the agent bank, but also the Ministry of Finance to take a position in the Ministry of Finance loan. We'd had the opening for the office. Our senior management had been in Seoul. They'd met all the key policymakers. There were regular meetings annually at the IMF World Bank, and when Koreans came to Chicago, which they did on a periodic basis. So when MOF came to us and said, essentially, this is the highest priority we had, and also when another one of the 4 management banks at that time dropped out, I worked closely with the head of the international department and the senior management of the bank to step in and take that role. And the decision was made, and the bank never regretted it.
We've used the expression here, cross-border risk. There's a page in the handout on, again, we didn't want to be too technical here, but those of you who are having trouble sleeping at night can take a look at that. Jim?
Yeah. Well, we had, as I mentioned, a fairly good background in Korea. The Korea Exchange Bank was in the Midland building, and so my contact with, as a younger banker, was with a lot of the Korea Exchange Bank guys, and because of that, I think we had a very good relationship, and the bank was favorably inclined toward Korea to begin with. That's not to say that it was easy, but I did have some credibility, and having a master's degree in international economics didn't hurt either. But by the same token, when we went in, the Koreans really hadn't decided whether they wanted to allow more banks in or not. And whereas we thought we were going to be it's going to be very easy for us to open the rep office. It took some time. So we were, for a while, back and forth between Tokyo and and Seoul. But in any event, having the rep office there gave us a good opportunity to feed a lot of information back to our credit people in New York. So going in, and we'd done a lot of financing, red clause letters of credit were the big thing, where the advance goes to the borrower first. And so we'd done a lot of that, and our country limit actually kept creeping up as a result of the stuff that we were doing with a lot of the Korean banks, because the Korean banks then were guaranteeing corporate loans that we would make to a JEL, a Samsung, or some of the larger Korean companies. So we did have that background, but as I said, to a certain extent, we were reaching our limits. So I remember one of the things that I wrote back in justifying this, the exposure that we were going to take on in addition, by starting off and dating this memo, 4,000, I think it was 4,208, which at that time was the date in Korea. And the emphasis I was trying to make was that these guys are going to be around for a long time, in spite of the fact that they'd gone through a history which was not very pleasant with the Japanese. But again, where they had come from and how they had essentially revived like a phoenix, essentially, after the Korean War, which had totally decimated the country. That was, I think, well, when I look back on it, I don't know how I managed to do it, but I think that, to a certain extent, there was also, we're in there. We need to protect the exposure that we already have. This is a major, it was symbolic in the sense that the Koreans, were you a friend of Korea or are you not a friend of Korea? And many of the Koreans looked at it that way.
I think at the time, and in particular, some of the local situations of those who actually had branches, Korea took in foreign banks in 1967 as branches. There were 3 American banks, Chase, Bank of America, and Citi, who were kind of the traditional branch banks of the time. Up until 1974, 75, I think Korea still had a bit of an ambiguous attitude. about
Mhm.
international banks. And this really marked a very large change, which I'd like to address very briefly, in how Korea organized its international finance policy. And fundamentally, it's not a fancy mathematical thing or anything like that. What Korea decided was that international banks, and at the beginning, particularly the American banks, uh, were Korea's friends. And the way you deal with friends is to work in a friendly fashion. Um, we had quite a bit of trouble at the beginning getting information from the guy who was the head of the International Bureau in the Ministry of Finance. Um, he just had this, very bluntly, this old Mandarin attitude that you don't tell these guys much of anything. They're supposed to do what they're told. Happily, the government got that message and promoted him to be the head of the Tobacco and Ginseng Bureau of the Ministry of Finance, which was a very prestigious appointment because that was the oldest bureau of the Ministry of Finance, which they'd made their money in the 19th century when they got started. And they brought in a man called Chung In-young, who had been the attaché, Ministry of Finance attaché in London. And Mr. Chung subsequently did lots of things in Korea, and his last job was as the Deputy Prime Minister, which is the chief economic officer. But under his leadership, and I think he had to push a lot because not everybody agreed with him all the time, that he continued to pursue the policy that one of Korea's major resources should be its relationship with the international banking community. In this context, he also did quite a number of things, which I won't bore you with in the details, to free up the operations of the foreign branches in Korea, so that, for example, we could generate Korean won by swapping dollars, which for branch banks is a big deal because the international companies that we served, what they wanted to borrow from us was Korean won, not dollars. Just as one quick example of his imagination, a couple of us wanted to open branches in Busan, which I think didn't turn out to be a particularly good idea over the years because Korea was so centralized, had become so centralized. But anyway, he went to the president to persuade the president, and his argument was, well, if there's a war, we're going to need the foreign banks to pay for ammunition, and they're not going to stay in Seoul. So you better give them a rear base from which they can operate. And of course, the president, I think, as an old military man, certainly understood those things. So, and this is a policy that worked over the years. Korea had another severe balance of payments problem in '79 and '80, resulting from the change of power in Iran, and then in 1997 and 98 in connection with the Asian financial crisis. And each time, Korea was able to look to its foreign banking friends. In 1998, particularly, a much larger and more multinational group than in the early days to support them. But we've been big on theory and kind of international finance, but one of the things that we can talk about, since we were actually there, was what banking business was like on the ground in Korea. John, why don't you start with that?
Well, I'd just like to say that what always impressed me and impressed a lot of people about Korea was the successful economic growth. They set high goals for themselves. They tended to meet those goals. And also we in the banking community were in for the long haul. Personally, I was really impressed by the quality of the Koreans I met. There were an awful lot of Koreans who'd done advanced degrees in the United States, come back to take on roles in their family businesses. A close friend of ours was Dr. Kim Jae-ik, who helped write the 2 5-year plans for Korea. He was a Stanford PhD. He worked very closely with Nam Duck-woo, the Deputy Prime Minister, who had an advanced degree from Oklahoma. Jae-ik tragically died in the Rangoon bombings. I would also like to say that America had very good ambassadors when we were in Korea. Philip Habib was there. Dick Snyder and Don Gregg was in the mission and later became ambassador. So they were all good people. They helped not only us, but our customers through their commercial and economic groups.
Well, I I feel the same way. I had grown to really admire the Koreans over time, and it was always a pleasure to work with the Koreans. I always felt that the Koreans were never they were how would you describe dedicated to the country, to making the economy work, and you felt that from the lowest level to the more senior level. I just wanted to mention also that in recalling what was going on at the time of the loan, I found it very interesting, and this was very helpful to us because I was thinking Jerry Ford was there, Henry Kissinger was there, Herman Kahn was there, and so this helped, I think, in the credibility of the country.
From my point of view, as the manager of the Citibank in Seoul, one of the most fun things that I got a chance to do, not always, but from time to time, was to go out and visit the factories of Korean companies. And normally we would do this in connection with financing activities. Banking in general is a quite abstract activity, lots of numbers and concepts, and particularly these days. But in those days, Korea was really moving ahead. And, you'd make a loan in 1975, and in 1976, you could go and see the factory that had been built with that loan. One I particularly remember was the cold rolling mill of the Pohang Steel Company. It was provided by the Mesta Company in Pittsburgh with an Ex-Im financing, in fact, and Citibank did that, and then a certain amount of unguaranteed and Euro market financing went with that, and so on. It was $100 million or something like that. I can't remember the exact thing, but anyway, we went through all the documentation and so on, and then kind of a year or 15 months later, we made one of our periodic visits to Pohang, and here was this beautiful rolling mill, and I must say Korea still in those days was a little bit messy, but boy, you could have eaten off the floor of that plant. Of course, you have to do that in a rolling mill because you don't want to damage the quality of the steel. Famously, the Hyundai company built their shipyard in Ulsan and 2 ships at the same time. And I think one of the reasons, and one other point I'd make is we never saw it too much, but one of the big activities during this period was helping the Korean construction companies with their business in the Middle East. And there's the saying that what doesn't kill you will help you to be stronger. And in some ways, the oil crisis was exactly that way. It put lots of money in the hands of people who needed what Korea could provide. And, the construction companies, I'm sure, must have been like the factories in Korea. They looked like military operations, and everybody was saluting and jumping up and down, back and forth, and lining up and everything. And for, I think, all of us who were involved in Korea, that at all these different levels, whether talking to people in the government, whether being out with the clients or actually seeing what they were doing, that there was this tremendous impression that this was a country that was really moving ahead. I think on retrospect, and we've talked about this a little bit, the numbers probably weren't quite as good as we might have hoped that they were at the time, and we didn't quite know what was going on. But what you could see was what I'll call the moral force of the place, that everybody, and certainly I had between 80 and 100 people working with me in the branch, and there were a few of international people, and mainly Koreans, and just everybody worked hard. They wanted to learn. They moved ahead. They took over doing things that was maybe initially done by a foreign specialist, certainly by the time I left, in fact, and certainly now. That the operations of, I think, all the foreign banks in Korea are mainly Korean and with foreign banks. But I think for all of us, in a way, people come before numbers. And if the people are right, then the numbers will be okay.
May I just add something to
Please.
that, because it occurred to me. To me, it was very interesting to go out to see the dollars at work, if you will. And I remember going down to Hyundai and driving the first pony car. And I'm thinking, where are the Koreans going with this? I mean, they have, this is the aggressiveness, assertiveness. You know, we're Korean, we can do anything, we can make this work. Pohang Steel, the whole idea of shipbuilding, well, you know, okay, you're imitating the Japanese in shipbuilding, but where are you going to go? You can't build ships. But look what has happened. I mean, Hyundai's all over the place in the United States selling cars. They are the major shipbuilder these days. I believe they are. I haven't kept up with it. The Koreans had such determination and just, I mean, just you know, nothing is going to stop us. We are determined to move ahead, and that's still going on.
Well, you really had the seeds in those days of building the chaebol, the large corporate groups, and there were some errors that happened in that process, but a transition from a very directed economy to a much more market-oriented economy.
Mm-hmm.
There were mistakes made, but on the whole, it went along quite well, and the Koreans took a great deal of pride in their success. A key factor is they also understood that people had to make money. And I think we'd all agree that the bank operations were pretty profitable. Korea was an emerging market, a developing country, so they realized they had to pay a bit more than a more developed country would pay. So it was an attractive place to work. It wasn't easy. It was never done till it was done. I mean, sometimes I'd be negotiating alone, and you'd find that you were on totally two different tracks. But I had a deputy who was fluent in Korean, and it took a while for the Koreans to realize that he understood what they were talking about on the other side of the table. So that was helpful on occasion. But overall, I left when the branch was opening and have been back a number of times over the years. But it is really impressive what the Koreans have achieved. Politically, you look at the Park Chung-hee regime and where Korea now is as a democracy. You look at Korea's leadership not only in electronics, technology, but you know, you look at the head of the World Bank, major institutions, the Koreans have really made their mark on the world. And I always kind of feel that back in the mid-70s, that was sort of when it was cooking and getting ready to go.
Yeah, I think all three of us feel that's the fire was really kind of got going at that point, and particularly in the 70s. I think we're coming to close to when we should finish our panel discussion. Jim, have you got some final words?
Well, final words.
Final words for this panel. You
Yes.
can say more later.
Very, I think I have to go back and follow through where Korea has come from to where it is now with this whole thing, because it's been part of my life. When I was first in Korea, the paved roads only went to Suwon. And I had the opportunity at that time, Kara had a contract with the Korean government to run a school lunch program, and we were doing a lot of rehab work also throughout the country. So I had the chance to travel throughout Korea. And I can't tell you how many yogwons I taught the people how to make scrambled eggs. Because I like Korean food, but not first thing in the morning. Anyway, I went back then as a banker and saw the Korean development. To a certain extent, it was like being on the frontier. It was very exciting. Subsequent to that, I kind of lost touch with Korea, although I was handling Korea for a brief interim in the early 90s. But I've been back in 2002 and 2012. And now, if I go back again, I'm wondering whether they're going to pave the entire country, because the road system, the development is just remarkable. And I remain impressed and very fond of Teanmingo.
I guess I could comment a little bit about what Korea meant to me personally. All through my professional career, working with multinational corporations, project finance, trade finance, managing and developing a diverse group of people in banking, that all kind of started in the days that I was in Seoul, and served me in good stead during that time. We were last back in January, had a wonderful Lunar New Year dinner, home cooked by Sunja Lee, JX's widow, her son, who's an intellectual property rights lawyer. And she gave me a book by her grandson that he translated in high school in the Bay Area, Tears of Blood, a Korean POW's fight for freedom, family, and justice. He's now a student at UC Berkeley. He was born in the States. But that link for him to Korea is still there. And the story of the divided Koreas and what it meant to be a South Korean POW in the North is a story that really isn't focused on that much. My wife, Judy, was on the Fulbright Commission in Seoul, so we got to know a lot of academics. It's continued. And we both got involved with a conservation group to save cranes. And in fact, for the last 4 or 5 years, the International Crane Foundation has been working in North Korea with a project in the Ambion Plain. And there are frankly very few American organizations, if any, that do that. So Korea is still a fascinating place that's evolving. It's earned its leadership role, and it's helped us in the way we've developed as people, as individuals, and as professionals.
I guess I get the last word. I would briefly focus on a little more on the time that we were in Korea. We're all fairly old now, but this was 40 years ago when we were quite young. And indeed, the American banking community all across Asia was basically a community of young people who were having the times of their lives, frankly speaking. The Asian countries, Korea among them, but not only Korea, were strongly developing. We had the opportunity to develop new ideas and different ways of doing things, bringing things in from the outside, and so on and so forth. So I think that all of us, and the three of us just as three representatives of hundreds, can look back on those days as very our positive experiences, which have, of course, as Jim and John have indicated, carry forward yet till today. But at the time, boy, that was, if you wanted to be complimentary to Korean friends in those days, you'd say that they were tough. And indeed they were. And it wasn't always so easy, but it was a great time that we all had. And I think we can now look back on that and see what happened. And I think all of us feel very proud of our own work and that of our institutions in supporting the country.
Well, I want to take this time to really thank all three of our presenters tonight for such an illuminating, interesting presentation. It was so thoughtful. We really appreciate your contribution from when you were there on the ground, and we certainly, you did contribute so much through your experience and through working side by side with Koreans there in the success story that we see Korea today. So please join me in thanking all of our speakers today.